Good evening and welcome to this episode of Beef Tips and Gravy. I'm John Houston, Director of Business Services for ProTrition Feed. I'm happy to have Dr. Kevin Cox, Chief Operating Officer for Alliance Animal Care, and as well as a practicing veterinarian. We're happy to have Dr. Cox with us. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Cox. And as we start this episode, we want to be sure that we focus this episode more on our stocker calves. And so as we think about that, I think about two separate divisions. One, a person who's buying what I call put together calves through the local sale barns and putting a load together. And then a second category of those who might be weaning their own calves on the farm and keeping them through a stocker phase before they market those calves. So as we think about those two categories, let's first talk about the put together calves. What diseases would you be concerned about and that you would recommend vaccinating for as those calves come in after being through a sale barn and as they come in and begin to get them started on feed and that kind of thing?
Well, with put together cattle, we certainly worry more about their exposure and their risk to the respiratory viruses that they might encounter in a sale barn. We know that those respiratory viruses are the primary invader, and then they suppress the immune system and allow for secondary bacterial infections to get started. So we really are most concerned about IBR and BVD viruses. And we really want to be aggressive at protecting cattle against those so that we can avoid bacterial infections like Pasteurella or Haemophilus or Mycoplasma, God forbid. But we also are worried about getting immunity quickly in those cattle. So we might vaccinate put together cattle slightly differently and choose a slightly different route of vaccines for cattle that have had such immediate stress and immense stress of coming through a sale barn facility.
Okay, so as you think about that and you think about those viruses, what vaccination methods would you recommend? I know certainly there's some intranasal type vaccines, and there's some injectables. And how would you recommend going about just a standard vaccination protocol for a group of put together calves?
Well, certainly for put together cattle, we would really seriously consider intranasal vaccines for the virus components, the IBR and the BVD. We're really concerned about getting immunity in that group of cattle quickly, and we know that intranasal vaccines can provide really quick immunity. So we know that the BVD portion of that is probably the most important part, and we might delay some of the other vaccines that are really hard on the body, things like blackleg, and or even some of the harsher Pasteurella vaccines. We might delay those a little bit, but really focus on those intranasal vaccines that are focused on getting BVD protection in them so quickly.
Okay, so would you recommend in these put together calves, would you recommend modified live vaccines or killed vaccines or both, or what would you recommend in the put together calves?
Yeah, that's a great question. You could probably get a lot of different answers on that question too, but in my opinion, the modified live vaccines are probably the route to go. And the reason we want to do that is because we need such strong immunity. And it's not that we're going to get bad immunity from killed vaccines, but we're going to get quicker immunity from the modified live vaccines, and we are going to get really strong. So most of the time, we tend to use those in put together cattle. Now, if you weren't doing any intranasal vaccines and you were going to use all injectable, then you might make an argument for using a killed vaccine at that first dose.
Okay, so when the cattle come in, what would be your recommendation of treating everything with an antibiotic right off the trailer, so to speak, whether they show signs of sickness or not, whether they're fevered or not, just treating everything with an antibiotic? Injectable, I'm talking about. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm a real proponent of metaphylactic antibiotic treatment, and metaphylactic is just a big word for saying it's a preventive antibiotic. And so while we know that that's very expensive, we also know that provides some good protection and in the long run can actually save money. So there are antibiotics that are labeled to be used metaphylactically. And with those that are labeled, they have a specific dose that are designed as the preventive label. I recommend doing that. Now, an alternative to that, I'm anticipating your next question, I think is probably metaphylactic antibiotic treatment in feed. And so one of the ways that you could do that would be to have a relationship with your local veterinarian and have a VFD written for an antibiotic that you could put in the feed, chlortetracycline or auramycin or CTC as some people might know it. And you can do that in pulses, or you could do that for 14 days. But that is another way to do a preventive antibiotic that's not injectable. It's a feed-through.
Right. And so the injectable antibiotics that are labeled to use in that way, most all of those, I'm sure, would be prescription type antibiotics.
They are all prescription antibiotics. Yes, they would require a relationship with your local veterinarian, and he or she would have to write a script for that antibiotic.
So thinking along that line, because you and I know that these, if you've been in the cattle business very long, they're going to get sick. Even after you get them out, they get started on feed, they're going to get sick. Somebody somewhere is going to get sick, and so we're going to start using antibiotic therapy in most cases. Talk a little bit about the classes of antibiotics, all of which are basically all of which are prescription antibiotics, but there are different classes, and we can mess ourselves up.
Sure.
If we're not familiar with those classes and how they're used.
Right. So yes, the huge majority of the antibiotics that are used in the soccer industry would be prescription antibiotics, and we classify those. There are classes of drugs, but then there are also two broad categories, bacteriostatic and bactericidal, and that's the classification on the way that the antibiotic kills the bacteria. And so in general, there might be one tiny little exception to this rule, but in general, we don't use a bacteriostatic antibiotic at the same time that we're using a bactericidal antibiotic. So static kills the bacteria by inhibiting the growth or slowing the growth, and a cidal drug would kill a bacteria by causing it to lyse or bust open. And so for the most part, if we're using an antibiotic that we know to be a bacteriostatic antibiotic, then we would not use a bactericidal antibiotic at the same time. And if you're wondering about which antibiotic is which, it's listed on the back, and so you may need to get your glasses, but you can read that on the back of the label and determine what kind of antibiotic that you might be using. And we never combine those. Now, in terms of classes of antibiotics, there are certain combinations that you can use together, but we would, for instance, if you're using a fluoroquinolone like Baytril or something like that, then we wouldn't generally use that with a cephalosporin like Exceed or Exenel or Naxel, for instance.
Right. So we need to keep all that in mind. And sometimes we give an antibiotic and we don't think it's working. Many times we don't give it long enough to work. But when we get in that position, we want to make sure that we're not crossing over on some of those modes of action, so to speak. So, and also as we're talking about antibiotics, I think it would be important to tell our audience what's coming for the few over-the-counter antibiotics that we still have today. In a very short period of time, those will become prescription as well. Things like our oxytetracyclines and our penicillins and things like that.
So right now, the only injectable antibiotics that are left on the market are the oxytetracyclines, so things like LA200 or Noromycin LA300, and then the penicillin drugs. And we know that in, I think, August of 2023, that all injectable antibiotics that are OTC that are left are going to transition over to RX antibiotics. And so it's really important. It's never been more important than now to have a good relationship with your local veterinarian, because inevitably you're going to need, whether it's in the stocker industry or any other kind of livestock industry, you're going to need some type of antibiotic. And so your relationship with your local veterinarian is paramount to making sure that you can have access to that.
Great. So let's back up all the way to the beginning and talk about the other half. Right. So we have a situation where I have my cows on the ground, or my calves on the ground, and so I want to keep those. I'm going to wean them at home, and I'm going to keep them for 60 days, whatever the case may be. How would I treat them differently from a vaccine standpoint, or would I treat them much the same?
No, I would encourage people to consider treating them differently. We know that the process itself of weaning is sometimes stressful, but once you've done that, then you can start a vaccine protocol that's a little more aggressive, quite frankly. And because you don't have the risk of bringing in new diseases by going through the cell barn, then you can use a vaccination protocol that might put a little more stress on those cattle, but it does provide really good immunity. And so we wouldn't worry as much about blackleg vaccine and timing of that. We might be aggressive and do 2 rounds of modified live instead of considering the intranasal vaccine that we would use on cell barn cattle, or potentially the killed vaccine on the first dose. So we would just make sure that those cattle are well vaccinated, but we wouldn't have the same concerns that we would if we were bringing them in. And certainly a metaphylactic antibiotic wouldn't be, something that you would consider in cattle that you were putting together from your own farm. But the vaccine protocol would probably be a little more aggressive.
Okay. So also, what if I wanted to vaccinate those calves 30 days before weaning, and then give them the booster after I've weaned them? How would you recommend going about that? Should I use a modified live both places? What would I do there?
There used to be some concern about using modified live vaccines on calves that were still nursing cows, a risk of causing some backward transfer of antibodies to the maternal cow, and she might abort a calf that she was carrying in utero after she'd gotten bred back. The technology on the vaccines is so much better now than it used to be. We don't worry about that as much, especially if that cow has been vaccinated with a modified live vaccine at some point in her life before. So yes, vaccinating those calves 30 days prior to weaning is a great idea. That puts a lot of the stress of the vaccine and takes it away, because you don't have to worry about the weaning process during that time. And there's very little risk involved to the maternal cow.
Okay. Well, Dr. Cox, thank you so much for being with us on this episode. I appreciate your time and all your attention to detail with our conversation this evening. I want to say to our audience that a lot of the vaccines, and all of the vaccines for that matter, that Dr. Cox has mentioned are available at your local co-op, and also those antibiotics. Be sure you have a relationship with your local veterinarian so that they can provide those for you. Thank you for viewing this episode of Beef Tips and Gravy.